For New York City, normality is a state of constant change. Since the loss of the Twin Towers, the island of Manhattan has continued to transform itself, as it has done since the founding 4 centuries ago, from a Dutch village to America's most densely packed urban environment.
Now let me paint you a picture. The year is 1624. The Dutch have just settled on the Hudson River, and only 2 years later established a colony of New Amsterdam in Manhattan. Now the English quickly gained control of this area via peace treaty with the Dutch, and named the region New York after the Duke of York gained charter over the land.
As the city changed its appearance, so did its population. From 1855 to 1924, 20 million people passed through New York's immigration centers, first at Castle Clinton and then at Ellis Island. Although they settled in many parts of the country, millions stayed in the city, forever changing the face and culture of its neighborhoods. From 1892 to 1924, 12 million people were processed through these buildings. Henry James visited the center at the height of its operation in 1907, the single year in which more than 1 million people had entered. As he described in The American Scene, the arrivals had to undergo a long and tedious process of officially entering the United States. But strict quotas established in 1921 and 1924 severely limited the number of people who could enter the country. From 1925 to the facility's closing in 1954, only 2.3 million immigrants passed through Ellis Island, still more than half of those entering the United States.
By the 1930s, the southern tip of Manhattan was covered with many skyscrapers. Researchers began to wonder why the island wasn't sinking, but it was because hundreds of years ago the land was built on bedrock with heat and pressure. When the Dutch settled in Manhattan in the 17th century, they began expanding the land with dirt and rocks.
Titled Liberty Enlightening the World, the Statue of Liberty had been proposed in France in 1865 during the reign of Napoleon's third repressive monarchy. The man behind the idea, Edouard de la Boulaye, a fervent abolitionist, wanted to celebrate both democratic freedom and the Union victory in the Civil War. The broken shackle and chain at the statue's feet symbolized the emancipation. Sculptor Frédéric Auguste Bartholdi designed the statue, and Alexandre Gustave Eiffel, the creator of the Eiffel Tower, in 1889, engineered its steel skeleton. The colossal figure became a stirring symbol of welcome to millions of immigrants arriving in New York in the late 19th century. In 1903, a plaque was installed inside the pedestal bearing the now famous lines by Emma Lazarus, "Give me your tired, your poor, your hurtled masses yearning to breathe free." In 1916, German saboteurs exploded a cache of dynamite on a nearby wharf, popping some bolts in the statue's arm.
The stock traders began doing business in 1790, but the stock exchange was actually not formed until 1817. The organization moved 10 times before establishing its base of operations in 1865, and the grand headquarters were officially built in 1902. The building was inspired by the Temple Corinthian style, which was a big trend in the early 21st century. Fun fact, actually, the statues carved into the stone on the side of the building represented integrity protecting the rights of man. They deteriorated so badly over time that the people had to secretly go in and repair them with sheetrock because they didn't want intentions of implied crumbling integrity.
Proposed in 1857 by the German-born engineer John Augustus Roebling, construction of the bridge finally got underway in 1869. John was killed in an accident shortly afterward, and his son, Washington Roebling, took over the demanding work. The Brooklyn Bridge took 14 years and $16 million to complete, 3 times the original estimate and more than any other single endeavor of the day. Excursion boats like the one on the foreground were still an important way to travel to New York to other coastal cities, but the new bridges and automobiles would revolutionize transportation in the new century. As cars and trucks supplemented ships and boats, the Brooklyn Bridge proved to be a lasting structure in the modern world with relatively few changes. 19th century New Yorkers crossing on cable cars, horse-drawn trolleys, and electric trains could not have imagined how the bridge would prove adaptable to motorized vehicles. The bridge was built so well that for the first 70 years of its life, well into the age of the automobile, it required only one routine maintenance. In 1953, the deck was strengthened to bear the weight of increased motor traffic. No longer the largest or most innovative, the bridge still captures the imagination for its grace and beauty.
New York City has had a variety of transportation over time. For instance, the Hudson River Pier served many kinds of vessels, such as boats loading rail cars, building materials, and even travelers in some cases. The White Star Line, which was a British shipping company, had several ships, including the Titanic, which carried passengers for commercial use, as well as transporting immigrants and troops during World War I. Grand Central Terminal was built as the gateway to New York City, completed in 1913. The new terminal brought together several railroad lines under one roof and led to the city's expansion past 42nd Street.
New York's Irish Catholic community was the city's largest immigrant group when the construction of this grand cathedral on 5th Avenue and 15th Street began in 1858. Thousands contributed their nickels and dimes to make it possible, but a generation would pass before it was ever completed. Just 2 years after the foundation was laid, the work was interrupted by the Civil War and did not begin again until 1869. Although the cathedral opened to visitors in 1879, the twin spires required additional funds and were not finished until 1888. During this 30-year construction period, the neighborhood surrounding the cathedral changed from a raw outpost to a wealthy enclave.
Times Tower, now located in the intersection of 42nd Street, Broadway, and 7th Avenue, became the new home of New York Times in 1904. The paper's old location opposite City Hall had been the nerve of the city, but Times publisher Adolph Ox knew that the new subway, which reached 42nd Street in 1904, would bring rapid expansion to this area. Ox convinced the subway company to name the 42nd Street station after his paper, and the area soon became known as Times Square.
At the start of the First World War, Times Square was the center of the theater district and attracted a large number of visitors. This made the square an ideal place for billboards. In 1917, the first large electric display billboard was installed. 11 years later, the first running electric sign was lit for the first time to announce Herbert Hoover's victory in the presidential elections. The billboards have become such a tourist attraction for the area that the zoning now requires the buildings to be covered with billboards. A century after the New York Times' daring move to a remote location, Times Square has become one of the busiest and flashiest sights in the city. Like the Times Square Tower itself, now covered with billboards, the area is totally transformed.
Development of the elevator, telephone, and electric lighting in the late 19th century produced not only skyscrapers, but also palatial department stores and the largest and most lavish hotels in the city's history. Today, New York is an astonishing mix of old and new, an ever-changing picture of a dynamic city.